My historical analysis event was over Carl Jung separating from Sigmund Freud and his views. I'm just going to talk a little bit about like their first meeting, what came about from it. They had corresponding letters, which were very significant in the history of the psychoanalysis world, and what kind of like took place in that, because what we know now is that they eventually separated, and they have gone on from then, and they formed their own complete separate views in psychology. So we know a lot. I mean, now we know how like they have two totally different like philosophical bases, but at the time they seemed to like what each other's work was doing. So like around 1900, Carl Jung was on his way to becoming a successful psychiatrist at the time. He was working on mental illness in an asylum at the University of Zurich, and he was commenting on Freud's works at the time. Freud had just published the interpretation of dreams. So they had kind of started then around 1900, but I also wanted to point out some of the philosophical bases, a lot of like their differences in behavior, the unconscious, and one of the big things was like sexual motivation and the sexual gratification. They had two totally different views on that. That was obviously a big part of Freud, and Carl Jung didn't really accept like any of that. So that being said, they weren't obviously really focused on the philosophical basis then, but the work they were doing at the time, they seemed to really enjoy each other. So they started writing letters to each other, and within 11 months of them starting their letter correspondence, they finally met face to face, and their first meeting actually, they talked for, it was said to be 13 hours straight. So they had a lot that they could talk about, I guess. And from there, they started this new relationship. It became a very intimate, professional relationship that would go on for about 7 years. And after 7 years, which I'll elaborate on, they went their separate ways. So, but at the time, Freud was looking for a successor, and in his eyes, Jung was perfect for that. So it kind of became like a father-son like relationship. They became very close. Freud kind of said Jung was under his wing, basically. He was like his shining star. He said he was like his prince, basically, in some ways he said that. One of the main events that took place in between their relationship that I was going to focus on was the expedition to America, which we kind of learned about a little bit. We learned that like after the expedition, that was kind of how psychoanalysis was brought to America. But for Freud and Jung, there was other type of events that had happened for them that was significant. But the main one that I was going to focus on was that they had the idea to make an international association. So that idea came about, and then within the year, they made an international psychoanalytic association, and Jung was named president. They had their first meeting in Germany, and he actually held the position of president for 3 years, mainly because Freud was, every year he would come and he would insist that Jung needed to be president, and that it was his position to have, and that was kind of probably another push for him to keep him where he wanted him to be his successor. But, so that's kind of what Freud had in mind, but what he may not have known at the time was that Jung didn't necessarily want to become Freud's successor, but obviously he enjoyed working with him, he enjoyed learning from him. He was not above asking for any type of help, and they were obviously very close, but he didn't necessarily want to subordinate himself to Freud and Freudian views specifically. So they said like that was not really in Jung's nature. He was very charismatic, and he was very strong in his opinions and stuff like that. So he then, in 1911, published the Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, and that was kind of where he started taking out some of Freud's views and putting in his own. Like, he kind of got rid of the incest barrier that Freud had in there. A lot of the sexualization he didn't really want in there. He was focusing a lot on like the mythological orientation and symbolism. He was really into symbolism, and Freud was not at all. He was completely opposite of that. So after he published that, Freud kind of had seen that, okay, well maybe he's not really listening to what exactly I want him to, and he basically came out and he said, he had this quote, he said, "It's risky business for an egg to try to be cleverer than the hen. Still, what is in the egg must eventually summon the courage to creep out." And this was about the time that the building tension was there, obviously. So they both kind of knew that the incompatibility was pretty obvious to both of them by about 1912. And Jung was very persistent in his letters. So these are the type of quotes that they had in their letters, and they got pretty dramatic. And these were just some of the pieces of them. So he was like, you go around sniffing out all the symptomatic actions in your vicinity that's reducing everyone to the level of sons and daughters who blushingly admit to the existence of their faults. Meanwhile, you remain at the top as the father sitting pretty. For sheer obsequiousness, nobody dares to pluck the prophet by the beard and inquire for once what you say to a patient with a tendency to analyze the analyst instead of himself. So that was, there was a lot. There was a lot more too. He went on for quite a while, and Freud also replied kind of along the same lines. He wrote a letter. He actually didn't send the first letter, wrote it again. I think he wanted to add some more strong words in there, but basically he said, I don't want to continue this friendship. He's like, I will just, you don't mean anything to me anymore. So 1913 would be the last year they met in person, but their professional relationship wouldn't end until 1914 when Jung resigned from presidency of the International Association, and Freud was finally like, oh good, we're rid of him finally. And basically from then on, they went on to form there was Jungian psychology and Freudian psychology, as we know. They both went on to publish their own type of manuscripts, and at the same time they kind of were making jabs at each other still, but it wasn't necessarily known to the public. It was more to people that were in their circle. They knew that they still had a lot of hatred toward each other, just because they had a lot of hurt feelings, basically. So yeah, Jungian analytical psychology was created. He went on for the next 45 years. He was successful. We know Freud obviously was still very successful too. So, any questions?
How do you think things would have been different if Jung had accepted the secession and had taken over Freudian therapy?
Well, I think if he would have become his successor, there may not have been a lot of his works that he wanted to go create independently, and he started a whole new branch of psychology, the analytical psychology. And I don't know, the person that he was, since he was so strong and he was independent and he was outspoken, he was very outspoken. So if he could have maybe stayed under Freud, he would have become his successor, and he would have continued on psychoanalysis as Freud wanted him to, but I don't think that was really in his nature at all. And we wouldn't have had as much of the analytical side. Yes.
Nobody else is asking questions? So where do you think the pivotal point was, the tipping point between their relationship, where they go from besties to I hate you?
Well, I read a lot about it. During the expedition to America, they spent a lot of personal time together, a lot more time. They had, they were traveling together, and that was kind of when there was also something in there where they were talking about how they were talking with it wasn't Hall, but Hall invited both of them, and someone was saying how Jung was invited like on his own, not necessarily with Freud or just because he was with Freud, and like Freud's reaction was not okay with that at all. And he kind of actually had like a dizzy spell right after that, and so they were thinking that he was just like so caught off guard that Freud or that Jung was considered like his own pupil, not necessarily someone under him, and Jung might have taken that as like a sign that like he's only thinking of me as someone that has to stay under him and isn't a colleague like equal to him kind of thing. So it definitely, a lot of things happened on the expedition to America, I learned, because I had your book that you gave me, there were a lot of events that happened there, so somewhere around that time.